I get as excited about debt recycling as anyone, but today I thought I'd cover when it doesn't and when it does make sense. There's a common phrase when people speak about debt recycling: turn your bad debt into good debt. It sounds too good to be true, and I don't think people deliberately try to mislead, but there's one extra consideration. It increases the net borrowings. As such, you should only debt recycle if you'd plan to invest anyway and have the time frame and risk appetite to do so. Offset accounts and redraw facilities to a lesser degree can play tricks on us. So quite often I find people might actually invest more under this structure or debt recycle than they might otherwise. A thought experiment I like to go through with customers is that if you'd already paid off your mortgage, or if you'd put more into a deposit initially and you just have that as available equity in the property, would you choose to go to your bank or broker and ask to kind of re-borrow that? This is a good check to make sure it's an investment strategy as opposed to a tax strategy. So if the answer is yes to that, I'd say that's a green light. And if not, there's nothing wrong with just keeping it in the offset account or leaving it in the redraw and being a little bit more conservative. The next one isn't a red light, but I'd say it's a dark amber light. It's a common strategy for Australians who had their first home to, at one point in the future, go for that next home, and then at that point in time, make that previous home an investment property. At that point in time, any debt that's actually left on that is turned into good debt because it's then an investment property. With this in mind, you actually don't want to pay that down whilst it's non-deductible bad debt, because at that point in time, when it does turn into good debt, you'll have less than you otherwise would have. In this case, it's a little bit of a just check, should you debt recycle? Because if the time frame that you plan to go to that next property is, I guess, in the next year or a few years, you get those benefits over that period of time. But then once you're in that next property and it's an investment property, you've kind of extinguished debt that would otherwise be good debt at that point in time. So I'd say technically there's probably, I guess, times when it can actually make sense. But generally, if it's a shorter time frame in that situation, you'd probably consider, if you want to invest otherwise, investing cash or looking at other options. The next one is a slightly less amber light, but it's just a bit of a spanner in the works and requires a bit of pre-thought or just chatting with your broker to make sure that they understand your plan. In this situation, let's go back to that prior scenario where you plan to make the previous house an investment property. In this next scenario, your plan is to sell it around that same time and then just go to that next home. In that situation, you're effectively just changing your current principal place of residence. And in that situation, there always needs to be security against the loan. So when obviously you have a bad debt that you'd initially debt recycled, when you go to that next property, if you'd sold that property prior to buying that next property, there's no security there because the bank won't obviously have the share portfolio or ETF portfolio as security. So there can be some strategies around this. So if you speak to your broker, some banks, certainly not non-bank lenders, they might allow for those settlement proceeds to come in and then actually hold some in a term deposit as security. But it's just a little bit of a spanner in the works, as mentioned, to make sure that you pre-thought that strategy. The worst case scenario, I guess, is that you don't have those proceeds at settlement and you might actually have to sell some of the share portfolio and then realize obviously capital gains and then pay off the loan in that situation. And then you've obviously lost the deductions of that. In another world, if you have the proceeds there and you, I guess, got enough deposit for that next home as well, you can obviously just pay off that loan and then you're kind of in the situation that you would have otherwise been. But it's just one thing that I think people might not think about. So it's always great when somebody's in their final home and there's no plans to go to that next house, because then you can say, well, this is the structure at the moment. There's not going to be a change of security or anything, and it's a bit simpler and you don't have to think about it quite as much. Another amber light is if you or your spouse are working and you aren't maximizing your concessional contributions to super. So even though when you make that personal concessional contribution, if that was from borrowed money, or unfortunately you don't get the tax deductions on that, the debt that you use to contribute to super, but the upfront tax benefit in terms of that immediate tax deduction to you personally, that's quite incredible. So it's going to exceed any lost interest on that. So there's a bit of an opportunity cost that I think people like debt recycling, because you've always got those funds available outside of super. So if you plan to retire at 50 or 55, that you're not worried about the super accessibility age limits, which is 60. So I think a lot of people might just by default go to debt recycling, but I would always just do the check to say that, well, do you actually need these funds before 60? Because if you don't, I think that super becomes another option. It doesn't have to be an end all, depending on your capacity. But let's say that you plan to debt recycle, let's call it $100,000, and you and your spouse have available super contributions of $20,000 each in this financial year. So there'd be nothing wrong with saying, well, let's put $20,000 each into super and then debt recycling $60,000. Other than that, if you plan to be in your house for indefinite or no big plans for it and you want to invest anyway, debt recycling is one of the few free lunches in finance where you get that tax deduction on the interest you'd otherwise be paying. So it makes sense. So you can see the benefits of it in this other video that I'll put the link in the comments, and you can also download a calculator where you can kind of model out your personal situation here. Thanks so much for watching, and I plan to make more of these videos. So if you have any questions or have any topics or anything you'd like me to cover in future videos, put it in the comments and I'll try and get back to you. If not, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.